My daughter says she's too busy for me, but I remember when she couldn't sleep without my hug. Time changes everything, even love. I'm Claire Bennett, 49, and the night my phone lit up with "Sorry, Mom. I can't make Sunday." Too busy. I was standing at our kitchen counter with garlic on my fingers and a half-chopped bunch of basil under the blade. The good knife my husband Doug gave me for our 12th anniversary resting on the cutting board like a promise I had been keeping for years. A promise that dinner would be warm, the porch light would glow, and she would walk in and tell me about her day. The sink hummed with a slow drain. The dishwasher had a way of whining like an old dog when it ran past 9. Someone on the street said a basketball bouncing, and I could hear the thump-thump between the cracks of our old window. I stared at the text and felt an ache under my ribs, familiar and foolish, as if I had tripped over something in the dark that was always there and had, in truth, belonged to me all along. It's funny the way scent hangs onto memory. Garlic and basil can take me straight back to when Madeline, our Maddie, wore tiny footed pajamas with clouds on them and insisted the only way she could drift off was if I curled around her on that lumpy old couch in the living room, the one with the fabric that scratched our summer skin, and hummed the tune my mother used to hum to me without words, just a low thread of sound like a boat rope rubbing a dock. She would press her damp little hand against my collarbone, and even if the laundry piled to the ceiling or the answering machine blinked with messages from teachers about PTA bake sale signups, I would stay in that dark with the scent of detergent and the hum of the refrigerator, counting her breaths and memorizing the shape of her weight on my chest, because her body sang a song I didn't know I'd missed until I heard it, love in the language of pulse and patience. Our life back then was a trail of crumbs and appointments. I left work at the insurance office at 3:30 sharp on Wednesdays, coffee sloshing in a travel mug between my knees as I navigated the serpentine school pickup line, the crossing guard's whistle slicing the air, the minivan ahead of me rolling forward 2 feet every minute like the world itself was puttering to a stop. I'd glance in the rearview mirror and see Maddie, 4.5, in her car seat with her hair bleached lighter by the summer sun than I ever allowed the salon to make mine, humming nonsense to her stuffed rabbit, the one whose ears always smelled vaguely like maple syrup from Pancake Saturdays. We had our rituals: library story time on Tuesdays, handwritten notes tucked into lunchboxes on Fridays, Sunday suppers where my sister's boys would run through the backyard and set off the neighbor's dog, and I'd say, "Feed on the grass, not the garden. Doug worked hard on those tomatoes," and they'd grin with dirt on their cheeks. At church potlucks, I'd bring my mother's cobbler and agree to run the raffle even when I'd promised myself I'd say no this time. At the Little League field, well, in our case, softball, I'd clap until my palms stung even when the ball sailed behind the umpire and rolled to the fence, because showing up felt like the only spell I knew that actually worked. When Maddie was 8, she had a nightmare about getting lost in the grocery store aisles. We'd actually done it that day, for 13 minutes that were long enough to etch new grooves into my brain. And that night she wrapped her arms around me and said, "Don't go, Mama. If you go, all the lights go off." And I slept with one foot on the floor like a traveler who knows she may need to stand in an instant. I was not a perfect mother. There were burned grilled cheeses and a forgotten half-birthday crown, and that one time I missed the soccer picture day because the minivan decided it needed a new alternator more than I needed to be reliable. But I was there. I was there in the school pickup line practicing patience. I was there at the band concert with the wrong camera settings. I was there when she had strep throat and could only take medicine if I crushed it and hid it in applesauce and bribed her with stickers from the teacher aisle at the office supply store. All of that, the humdrum and the holy, felt like we were weaving a blanket that would always cover us both. Then the world picked up speed. Phones grew smarter than our hearts. 7th grade turned into 9th, and I learned the names of brand new anxieties I couldn't soothe with a song. PSATs, and app deadlines and endless group texts, and a location-sharing app she hated that I thought made me a responsible parent. We still had Sunday dinners with Doug making a salad no one wanted but everyone took a scoop of because raising a good man is nothing if not letting him believe his kale has a purpose, and Maddie would flick through her phone between bites, laughing at something that didn't involve us, and when I'd ask, gently, "Hey, what's so funny?" She'd shrug while still smiling at the screen and say, "Nothing," as if nothing could be that absorbing. At 15, she got a job at the ice cream place by the strip mall, and the first time I dropped her off for a closing shift and saw the manager, a sweet high school senior with a mustache that should have come with instructions, hand her a set of keys, I had to swallow hard against the instinct to say, "We keep keys for people, not places." I tried, God, I tried, not to make her independence about my fear, but the line is thin. It rubbed raw in places even when I meant to be tender. Late junior year, she went on a class trip to Washington, no politics, just monuments and museums and the bus smell. And when her texts turned sparse, my mind did its wild gallop. I sent, "How's it going?" And then, "You safe?" And then, "Sweetie." And by the time she replied 12 hours later with a photo of cherry blossoms, I had already imagined a dozen emergencies. She saw my missed calls and wrote, "Mom, you gotta chill." And we laughed about it. There was a whole joke about me using emojis wrong and sending a crying laughing face for something that was not that funny. But a splinter was in the wood now. When you run your hand along the grain, you forget and it catches you. Senior fall, we toured campuses with coffee-stained maps and a trunk full of granola bars, a cooler with homemade sandwiches, a notebook where I wrote things like East Side dorms. No, and the dining hall smells like soup in a good way. And she held my elbow crossing streets not because she needed to, but because she always had. I wanted her to choose the college 20 minutes away where I could drop off soup when midterms came, where the stadium lights from football games bounced off low clouds and made the whole sky look excited. She chose the one 3 hours away with red brick buildings that glowed at sunset and a creek running through the quad, and an art lab that smelled like clay and possibility, and a coffee shop that kept mismatched mugs. We loaded the car with bins and pillows, and a rug that Doug said was too nice for spilled ramen, but we hung it anyway, and we hugged in a dorm room that was still mostly bare, and told each other we were okay when we were not okay. When she stayed, and we drove away, I pressed my palm to the passenger side window at the stoplight like an idiot, like I could touch her shoulder through distance, and said out loud, to the traffic and the lone jogger and the deliverance of a green arrow, "Be good to her." The first months, we had a rhythm. Sunday night calls, quick midweek texts, the occasional photo of a latte with a heart on top that made my chest ache with its tiny craftsmanship. I mailed her care packages with wool socks and instant oatmeal and dollar store plastic dinosaurs just to make her laugh. And she called me when the washing machine ate her quarters, or when she accidentally bought baking powder instead of baking soda and made cookies that tasted like a science experiment. But as sophomore year turned into junior, the edges blurred. Her classes were harder. She took on a raw role that meant she was crisis manager, hall therapist, and fire alarm captain. She picked up shifts at that campus coffee shop where she came home smelling like espresso and sugar, and her texts came less like a tap on my shoulder and more like a leaf that happens to land at your feet. That night I stood with the basil and the soft-to-the-touch tomatoes and read Too Busy from her, and wanted to write back with 1,000 hearts, and "I miss you," and "I made your favorite," and also "Tell me what your busy is like." But I thought of all the times I had poured my worry into her cup, as if our love was supposed to be a ballast against the lives we're trying to build, and I only typed, "Okay, love you," and put my phone face down because I knew I'd stare until it lit again. The thing about love is it makes you keep setting the table. It makes you fold napkins into triangles and light a candle for no one, because the candle is for you as much as anyone, to remind yourself that warmth is not only received but also made. Still, I won't pretend I didn't loop through old scenes like trailers for a movie I'd watched so many times I could mouth the lines. The time she was 9 and cried at bedtime because I said I couldn't lie with her until she fell asleep and she said, "But you're my sleep button." And I went back in, because some battles you only win by laying down your arms. The time 8th grade Maddie climbed into the front seat, shut the door with a soft case of her violin in her lap, and said, "Can we just go fix this tooth now?" Pointing to the slightest crookedness, and I told her she was perfect and drove to the dentist anyway because that was what was in our budget, the imperfect fix that let her smile big without thinking. We used to have a running joke that I was always the last parent to leave the school parking lot because I once backed into a cone and knocked a line of them like orange dominoes. Teachers teased me for years about my cone massacre. I teased myself more and kept bringing muffins to the PTA meetings, sitting in the folding chairs in the multi-purpose room under the fluorescent lights that made even the most cheerful bulletin boards look a shade too green. I wonder now if all that showing up made me assume it justified me showing up everywhere. If the small heroism of carrying homemade pasta salad across a soccer field gave me a false permission to press when I should have softened. The inciting incident, if I had to name it, happened more quietly than I expected. I didn't lose her in a dramatic blowout or a slammed door or a speech about hatting me. Instead, it was a handful of tiny things. A canceled Sunday dinner here. A can't talk group project. There, my comments on her photos going unliked. The way she stopped telling me if she was walking home alone late even though I didn't think she should. And a Wednesday morning when I drove out to campus without telling her, with a tin of cookies wrapped in a checkered towel, thinking surprise would be a gift like it always used to be, and found myself peeking through the coffee shop window like a stranger. Watching her laugh at something the barista with the nose ring said as she smacked a dish towel against her hip, looking so incredibly like someone who didn't need me but still wore my face when she turned a certain way. I went inside, heart in my throat, and the bell above the door made a jaunty noise that felt unkind. "Mom," she said, and I saw it, just a flicker of panic across her kind eyes, and my hand went to my throat because I realized later that what I saw wasn't embarrassment of me, but a fear that I was going to step into her new world with my old certainty and rearrange the furniture. "I was in the area," I lied, which we both knew was not true, and held out the cookies. She leaned across the counter, kissed my cheek, whispered, "You have to text me before you come, okay?" And I said, "Of course," but the truth is I didn't know how to be the kind of mother you notified before you loved them. I left with a latte I didn't want, and the sound of milk steaming like an unresolved thought, and I sat in my car and cried the quiet kind that doesn't move your face, only your throat. That night I told Doug, and he squeezed lemon onto salmon like he always overdid, and said, "She's figuring it out, and so are you," which is the sort of thing people sew on pillows because they don't know what else to say. The next 2 weeks were a study in restraint. I texted less. I left the porch light on anyway. When she didn't show up on a Sunday, I plated 3 servings and Doug, and I ate on the back steps, our knees touching, listening to the hiss of a neighbor's sprinkler and the scrape of skateboard wheels down the block. And he told me about the new guy at his office who wore his ID badge like a medallion. And I told him about Mrs. Dansby from church who asked if we had photos of Maddie to put on the scholarship board. And I said, "I'll email her," and then didn't. Because I wasn't sure anymore what belonged to me to share. Then came a Wednesday when my phone buzzed with a message from my friend Tina, who volunteers at the library downtown and has a radar for things I need before I know I do. "Is this your Maddie?" With a flyer attached, a grainy photo of the campus open Mike night, featuring a few student readers. There was her name, spelling right and everything. Madeline Bennett reads from her essay, Boundaries, and my heart did that weird leap-lurch combination that means joy and dread have shaken hands inside your chest. I told myself I would not go uninvited, and then I put on a sweater and went anyway. Because curiosity and love have always driven me to bad manners. The student center auditorium smelled like dust and old carpet and, strangely, popcorn. The chairs squeaked when you shifted. An acoustic guitar leaned against the side of the stage near a hand-lettered sign that said, "Please don't touch the mic." I sat near the back, half hiding, watching students slide into their seats, laughing, in baggy sweaters and beat-up sneakers and scarves wound twice around like armor. And then there she was, my girl, hair gathered up the way she does when she means business. A ring on her hand I hadn't seen before, stepping into the square of light like it fit her. When she read, her voice shook for a syllable and then steadied, and she said, "People talk about helicopter parents like it's all hovering and rotors, but my mom is more of a porch light, and sometimes porch lights can feel like a spotlight if you haven't explained where you're going." And the room laughed softly, and I held my breath. She read about growing up in a house where love was dinner on the table and jingling keys at the door, and a mother who ran the bake sale and knew the names of all the crossing guards by the end of September. She read about being the good kid, who didn't smoke behind the bleachers or sneak out windows because she never had to. There was no rebellion to be had when your parent listened, and how she thought that meant she'd earned an adulthood where she could be private without guilt. She read about the gift and the weight of being known, how it was wonderful when your mom's friend from church shows up at your part-time job to ask about your midterm because your mom had told her. How it feels weird to know that when you cried at 11 because you lost a library book, half the PTA was sending suggestions by dinner. It wasn't cruel. It was not a roast. It was an honest essay written by a person who loved me and also needed air. And the line that got me, the one that rearranged something as irreparable and necessary as a broken bone that finally set right, was this: sometimes the people who love you most build a house around you and call it freedom. The room, bless them, clapped. A kid with a shaved head whistled. A professor with glasses hanging from a cord nodded in that way like she'd been waiting for that line all night. Maddie looked out and scanned the faces and didn't see me because I was smaller than I had ever been, and I slipped out the side and into the hall with its vending machines humming like a chorus, and the poster for a lecture about sea turtles flapping where it wasn't fully taped. I should say this clearly. What hurt wasn't that she called me out. What hurt was recognizing myself so fully in her words that I could not pretend I was a different person. I sat in my car with the heater ticking and opened the glove compartment, where I keep things like napkins and the emergency tape measure, and tucked in there for reasons that made sense once, the rabbit with the maple syrup ears, because I had brought it with the cookies and forgotten to hand it off. I pressed that rabbit to my face, and it didn't smell like syrup anymore, just dust and the inside of an old drawer, and I cried until I had to blow my nose into a fast food napkin. And then, because crying is fine but not a plan, I thought, okay, what now? Here's the quiet part, the vulnerable beat that doesn't fit on a flyer. I had to admit to myself that I had built my days around her in a way that made me holy and tired, and yes, lonely. And when she pulled away to save her own life, the way a rocket drops its boosters when it breaks the atmosphere, I didn't know what to do with the fuel I was left holding. I could keep throwing it after her, calling it love. Or I could build a small fire of my own and stand by it so she'd know where home is by the smell and the warmth and not the pull. I drove home slowly, past the grocery store where we'd once lost each other, and then found ourselves in the cereal aisle, a story we'd told so much it had become funny. Past the baseball field with the lights that make the dust look like glitter. Past the laundromat where a boy with earbuds in folded towels so precisely you could live your whole life by his corners. When I walked in, Doug was at the table reading the paper, a habit that makes him look like a man older than he is because the light catches the gray at his temples, and I said, "I went at campus." And he said, "I know," because he knows me, and I told him about the essay, every word I could remember, and he put his hands flat on the table, not in anger but as a way to steady himself, and said, "Okay, we adjust." The next morning, I did two things that felt like a kind of ritual. I opened my phone and scrolled through years of posts and took down anything that was not mine to tell, and it felt like dismantling a shrine you love. Painful, necessary, faithful. And then I wrote Maddie a letter on paper, because text can dodge and email can be forwarded, and I wanted ink on fiber to say, "I hear you. I'm sorry. I love you. I will not surprise you at work. I will not tell your stories to fill the quiet of my own. I will be a porch light and not a lighthouse that blinds you with beam." I wrote, "Tell me how to show up for you now, not the way I did when you were 8, and I'll practice." And I meant practice. Like a musician, like a student, like a middle-aged woman in a ceramics class making lopsided bowls on purpose because sometimes good enough is the shape of joy. I left the letter in her mailbox at the student center because I had learned that sending it to her dorm would land it in a mailroom black hole. And then I went to the community center and signed up to tutor third graders in reading on Tuesdays and to help with the chili cook-off in October, the one I skipped last year because I was too busy, which now struck me like an inside joke I had told on myself for years. It was not perfect. Nothing was fixed with a letter and a lopsided bowl, but something in me settled into a new kind of patience. I still set the table on Sundays, but sometimes with new recipes. I started using cloth napkins because I wanted to, not because anyone was coming to be impressed. When she texted, "Hey, can't talk, have a Raise Life meeting," I wrote back, "Got it. Love you. If you want a funny story about Mrs. Dansby's cat later, I'm here, and left it there. 2 days later, she replied with a string of question marks, and TF happened to Mrs. D's cat. And I told her the story with typing that made me laugh halfway through because the cat had found a hole in the drywall and taken up residence. By the end, she wrote, "I love you," which we say often, but that day it landed like a handshake over a newly agreed-upon fence. A week after the letter, she called on a Thursday afternoon while I was in line at the green market buying tomatoes that smelled like a July sun, and said, "Do you have a second?" And I said, "For you, always," which I knew could sound like pressure, so I added, "Unless you need me to have time tomorrow, in which case I'm free then too." And she laughed, not the ha-ha-ha of courtesy, but the warm chuckle of someone who believes in your efforts, and said, "Right now is okay." She told me things she had never told me. About the resident who knocked on her door at 3 in the morning sobbing, because she'd failed a test and felt like her whole life was broken. And how you can sit on a hallway floor with a stranger and talk them down from the ledge of their own narrative without ever making it about yours. About the professor who told her she had a voice and should use it, but also, be careful with the hands you place your voice in. And she looked at me through the phone, and we both knew she meant mine. She said, "I wasn't trying to hurt you with that essay, Mom. I needed to hear myself say it. I needed to practice asking for what I need without apologizing." I, to my own credit, said, "You did not owe me an apology for wanting air," and meant it, and also almost swallowed my own tongue because the old me had been clinging to the idea of an apology like it would prove I wasn't a bad mom. "But I'm sorry I came to the coffee shop," I added. "And I'm sorry I told Mrs. Dansby you were maybe coming home on Sunday when you weren't sure, because then she told everybody and it became a thing instead of a choice." She was quiet and then said, "Thank you," 2 words I never realized were so heavy until they landed on my heart. Then she said, "Also, I've been working so much because I'm trying not to ask for extra money this semester, and your heart will do a strange combination of ache and admiration at that sentence, believe me." She hadn't wanted to tell us because she didn't want me to worry, and there it is again, the loop of our love. "Maddie," I said, "we are your people. Tell us what you need." And she said, "I didn't want to disappoint you." And I leaned against the deli case and stared at a pyramid of green apples and felt the world tilt slightly because that word, disappoint, is the kind of thing that can live in your bones longer than any fluoride. "You could never," I said quickly, and then slower because I needed her to hear me. "You could never disappoint me by needing help." I transferred a bit extra into her account that afternoon with a note that said, "Proud of your hustle, buy vegetables," which she ignored in favor of buying a new planner and a sweatshirt with her hall's name on it. I let that be her business. This is where you understand that the climax of this story wasn't a raised voice or a slammed door, but a choice to do everything differently on a day when it would have been so easy to do it the same. A Saturday in late fall when the air smelled like smoke and the creek along the bike trail wore leaves like bracelets. And she called at noon and said, "If you're around, could we meet halfway today for lunch? There's a diner just off exit 62, the one with the neon sign that flickers." And instead of saying, "I'll come to you," or "Why not Sunday like we planned?" I said, "Exit 62, I know it, text me the time." And I put on a sweater that didn't try too hard and drove with the radio low. The diner had cracked red booths and pies under glass that someone had cut slightly crooked. A waitress with a name tag that said Nora called us honey like we were her own. We split a tuna melt and fries, and I told her about the ceramics class I had just started, and how my first bowl looked like it wanted to be a pitcher when it grew up. And she told me about her residence, prank of putting googly eyes on every poster in the hall, and we laughed until Nora asked if we needed more napkins. "Mom," she said, wiping salt from her fingers, "I need to tell you something else." And my heart did its old gallop, but it wasn't an emergency. It was a confession that lived in the soft light of the diner. Sometimes I feel like I'm failing everyone when I choose me. I remembered that 11-year-old who lost the library book and thought the overdue fine was a moral indictment, and I took her hands across the table, felt the ring I hadn't asked about, it was just a ring. It means different things at different ages, and said, "If it helps, I don't anymore. I used to, but I don't. I choose me some days. I want you to see me do that." She blinked like she was trying not to cry in a public place. a skill I had honed to a weapon, and I said, "Do you remember that porch light thing you wrote?" And she laughed and said, "It was a metaphor, Mom. I couldn't think of anything else." And I said, "Well, I took it literally for a while, and then I realized porch lights are on timers sometimes, and that's okay. We can set them. Wednesdays, I'll make soup at 5, and I'll leave it in the fridge with a note. If you make it, you make it. If not, I'll eat it for lunch. No questions, no guilt, just soup." She took a fry, thought about it, and said, "I love soup," which was our way of agreeing to a truce without making it official. That winter, the one with the ice storm that knocked down our neighbor's elm and made the whole block smell like sap and wet wood, we settled into a rhythm that didn't look like the one I had on the vision board in my heart, but it was ours. Semi-regular Wednesday soup that she made once in every 3 phone calls that were sometimes 10 minutes and sometimes 70. Texts that were sometimes a single photo of a sunset over brick, and sometimes a novel about a hard day. My volunteer tutoring turned into a club where I read with kids who smelled like school glue and asked questions that made me remember the joy of not knowing. I learned to throw a pot that didn't wobble. Doug and I started taking walks after dinner past the high school, where you can hear the marching band practicing in the dark like a joyful army. There were still moments that tested me. The Sunday she posted a photo of herself at a board game night with friends after telling me she was too busy for dinner, and the surge of hot sting in my chest that I had to breathe through and examine like a scientist. Was I hurt because she lied, or because she didn't choose me, and what was my responsibility here? I texted, "Looks fun. Love you," because love keeps the porch light on, not the police porch camera rolling. There was the night she called at 2 a.m., voice small as if she hoped someone else would answer, because a student had passed out at a party and she had handled it. But the adrenaline had left her shaky, and I answered sitting on the kitchen floor in the glow of the microwave clock and said, "Tell me what you did like I'm the nurse and you're the student." And when she told me, to my surprise, I said the sentence that was the truest thing I had in me. "I'm proud of you, even if your timeline looks nothing like my wish list." She exhaled, and I could hear the clink of her ring against the edge of a ceramic mug, and she said, "Thanks, Mom. I know." Spring softened. The high school's track team returned to the field, and you could hear the squeak of sneakers from our porch. The community center's bulletin board filled with flyers for summer day camps and pancake breakfasts. The block planned a barbecue for the first warm Saturday, and the cul-de-sac filled with lawn chairs and kids with face paint that smeared into streaks when they sweated. Maddie came home for that, not because I asked, but because she wanted to, and she arrived while I was pressing burgers with a thumbs and palm method my father taught me, and she kissed my cheek and stole a slice of cheddar. And later, when the sun slanted and the air smelled like char and cut grass, she tucked herself under my arm on the porch step and said, quietly, "I can't always do this, but I love when I can." And I rested my head on hers in that old way that fit us both and said, "Then this is enough," and meant it. Our story didn't end with a perfect fix that left everyone changed and unchallenged. It moved like the seasons, predictable if you knew what to look for and surprising if you forgot how wind works. There were setbacks. A Thanksgiving when she caught a terrible cold and stayed put, and I made stuffing anyway, out of habit and hope. A spring break she spent on a service trip instead of on our couch, and I bought new throw pillows as a way to scratch an itch for change that wasn't mine to scratch. A mother-daughter argument in April about the difference between checking in and checking up, where she finally said, "Mom, sometimes your concern feels like criticism." And I took a glass of water to the sink and let the tap run while I let that sentence be true without defending myself. And then I said, "Help me try again," and she did. And then, unexpectedly and as quiet as God, there was a Wednesday when she made soup. She let herself into the house with the key that had been hers since she was 12, pulled a stock pot from the bottom cupboard by the sink where everything is heavy, chopped onions that made her cry, texted me once for where we keep the bay leaves, and left the pot on simmer with a note propped against the toaster. "Carrot ginger, be gentle. It's my first try." And my whole chest felt like a room with all its curtains thrown open. I walked into the kitchen at 5:30 with my tote bag of library books, and the smell of broth hit me like a song I had almost forgotten. I ladled a bowl and searched the simmering for cumin and for the taste of her new life, and it was there, a little too much salt, a little too thick, leaning hopeful into something like comfort. She came through the door minutes later, cheeks pink from the walk, hair tucked into a beanie that had seen better winters, and said, "You always make it look easy." And I said, "It isn't." And we met each other's eyes like we were seeing that for the first time about both of us. "Can I stay?" she asked, unnecessary as a question and beautiful as a practice, and I said, "Always," knowing always was sometimes, knowing sometimes was everything. We cleaned up together, which is intimacy in a language you have to learn. She took the trough of the sink and scrubbed with that little brush I bought on a whim, and she always mocked because, "Who needs a brush for the pan's spout, Mom?" And I wiped down the counter and we talked about nothing and everything. The neighbor's new fence, the way wet leaves make the sidewalk slick, the boy on her floor who plays the same guitar chord until she can't tell if she's going insane or he is, the cat that now sometimes sleeps on our porch if we leave a dish out. Before she left, I handed her the rabbit from the glove compartment. It had migrated from the car to the kitchen shelf in a migration that meant more to me, probably, than to it. And she laughed with a little hitch and said, "Where did you even get this?" And I said, "You made it your whole childhood," which was corny and exactly true. And she slid it into her tote like she was taking something of mine that had always been hers, which is to say, love. Now, months later, if you ask me about being a mother to an adult daughter, I'll tell you this. It's learning to love with your hands open. It's making soup without asking if they'll be there. It's turning the porch light on at 5 because the days are shorter, and you know she might see it from the street, and the glow will feel like a small, stubborn hope. It's choosing to build a life that doesn't hinge on their arrival, so when they come back, it's because they want to, not because you engineered the weather. It's showing up when invited, being quiet when asked, and understanding that time does change love. It stretches it, moves it from the small rooms to the wider ones where the ceiling is higher and the echo takes longer. But the sound, if you listen, is the same. If you've ever sat on a kitchen floor at 2 a.m. to be a soft voice on the end of a hard night, or if you've stared at a text that says, "Too busy," and felt your dinner go cold in more ways than one, you know this ache and this joy. You know that you can be both hurt and proud in the same breath, and that's not a contradiction, it's a family. I keep the rabbit now on the shelf near the keys, next to a little crooked bowl I made that catches coins and chapsticks and ferry ticket stubs, and all the tiny proof that life keeps happening. The bowl and the rabbit are both imperfect and useful, and I think beautiful for that. And when I stand at the counter with basil on my fingers and my phone face down because I don't need it to tell me who I am, I can hear the echo of my own mother's hum and my own daughter's laugh, braided in a way that makes all the stopping and starting, the setting and resetting of our porch light, feel like practice for a love that will keep adjusting and keep us, in its way, whole. If you heard something of yourself in this, if it sits with you like a warm bowl of soup on a cold night, you can tap like and subscribe to hear more of our ordinary, extraordinary stories. And I would love to know, what would you have done?